Chapter 3. Sarah stared at the corner of the darkened basement where John and the machine calling itself Weaver had been standing moments ago. Where they had been was now only Cameron's body, sat inert and lifeless on the chair. Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. She just stared at the same spot as if looking at it would somehow bring John back. The only movement came from her lips as she faintly muttered, "I love you too." John, her son John, the only thing she really lived for, was gone, and in his place was only a feeling of hollow emptiness. Sarah's eyes narrowed and she glared at Cameron's body with intense loathing. She'd confided once in Cameron that she was afraid she'd lose John, and now she had, to the very one she'd confessed her fear to. She felt sick that her son had jumped to the future without any hesitation for a damn machine. He knew what was at stake and he'd ignored it all, tossed their mission to stop Skynet to the wind for a tin, can with a pretty face and a pert backside. She'd known John was attached to Cameron, very attached, but she'd never have thought he'd sacrifice the whole world for her. 6 billion lives for one. Not even one, she glowered. Cameron wasn't alive, she was just a machine. Sarah. Ellison shook Sarah out of her stupor and back to reality. She became aware of a fire alarm shrieking loudly at an ear-splitting volume, and also that the bright white lights that had illuminated the room before were off, replaced by emergency lighting that cast a blood-red hue over the whole room. Why were the lights off? "We've got to get out of here." He grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her towards the doorway. Sarah started to turn and follow when her thoughts came back to Cameron. "We can't leave her." Sarah pulled her arm out of his grip and turned back. "She's not here," Ellison replied as he stepped back into the room. "Her chip's gone, remember? But the body's here," Sarah shot back. "We can't leave it." If Kaliba or the FBI got hold of Cameron's body and reverse-engineered it, there'd be hell to pay. If Skynet launched Judgment Day with an army of Terminators ready from the starting whistle, mankind wouldn't stand a chance. Sarah looked on at the TDE controls and realized that was something else they couldn't let Kaliba find. Sarah shoved Cameron's body off the chair, picked the seat up and smashed it into the main computer terminal as hard as she could. Plastic and silicone shattered and spewed out onto the floor, and Sarah struck again with the chair. This time the remains of the terminal fell to the ground, but she still wasn't done. Sarah pulled out her Glock 17 and emptied the magazine into the nearby computers, blasting the remains of the TDE interface apart under a rapid barking hail of bullets and brightly flaring muzzle flashes that lit up in the darkened room, forcing Ellison to cover his ears from Sarah's barrage. "What are you doing?" he asked as Sarah lowered her gun and ejected the magazine from the pistol grip. "Who do you think crashed that drone into Weaver's office?" Sarah snapped. "Kaliba. They killed Charlie, they killed Derek. They tried to kill me and John, and now Weaver and that. John Henry, you think they're gonna stop now? They're working for Skynet. What do you think will happen if they figure out what this is and where John's gone? We can't let them get control of this thing." "How are they going to get back now you've smashed it?" "It doesn't work that way." Sarah turned away from Ellison and crouched down behind Cameron's body. "They're not coming back." She spotted the cyborg's CPU port cover on the desk above her and pocketed it, then patted down Cameron's hair over the empty, gaping hole in her head, hooked her hands under Cameron's armpits, and started to drag the cyborg backwards towards the door. "Are you going to help or not?" She stared at Ellison. Ellison picked up Cameron and slung the body over his shoulder in a fireman's lift and walked quickly out the door and into the bare, sterile corridor. It, too, was also dark, illuminated just barely by more emergency lighting. Sarah wondered why it was so dark in the basement. It hadn't been when they'd entered, and that was after the kamikaze drone attack. The basement level was completely empty, and they ascended the staircase completely undisturbed. The only sound was the blaring fire alarm, drowning out their footsteps clattering against the metal staircase. Sarah couldn't stand the racket it made. Not so much the noise itself, but the high-pitched, deafening shrieking made it impossible to hear if anyone else was approaching. They were greeted on the ground floor by a scene of chaos as suited office workers, executives, managers, and secretaries shouted out at each other, as they rushed to the front entrance to evacuate the building, shoving people towards the doors, shouting at people too slow on the uptake. Armed men in black SWAT gear rushed through the glass doors into the front lobby and ushered people through, waving them past the doors and outside towards safety. What the hell's going on? An overweight security guard asked one of the black-clad, heavily armed men. Someone crashed a damn plane into the side of the building. We gotta get you out of here as a precaution. Keep moving. The officer shoved the security guard outside the door and continued to manhandle people outside. Keep moving, exit the building, and cross the street as quickly as possible. The building could be unstable, so please keep moving. Is it terrorists? Someone asked. The officer didn't even look at the secretary as she spoke and instead shoved her roughly towards the door. Sarah wasn't surprised to hear someone ask that question. After what she'd heard, and the subsequent footage she'd seen of September 11th, she had no doubt that an aircraft, drone or not, flying into the side of the building would definitely get a lot of heads turning and generate a lot of fear. People would jump to the conclusion it was a terrorist attack. If only, Sarah thought, Al-Qaeda were just goddamn choir boys compared to Kaliba and their plans. Sarah looked down at the ground and away from the police, shielding her face from their view in case they recognized her. She'd escaped from prison only a few hours ago, and her face had been plastered all over the TV and the papers for the last 24 hours. There was a snowball's chance in hell they'd get past the cops without her being recognized. Ellison saw Sarah's reaction, then stared at the armed officers. Something wasn't right. "They're not cops," Ellison whispered to Sarah as they joined the line of people being ushered out in an orderly fashion. "What?" Sarah asked, still keeping her head down. "Armed police wouldn't be here for a plane crash," he said. "And look at their gear." Sarah looked up as the queue moved forward. They were only a few feet away from the nearest armed officer, if that's what he was. Ellison shifted Cameron's body so he was cradling her in his arms and leaned the damaged side of her face into his shoulder. Sarah brushed Cameron's hair over the rest of her face to disguise the wounds on the lesser damaged portion of her face. She dared to look up at the officers by the door, dressed out in full SWAT gear, helmets, body armor, black tactical clothing, HKG-36 assault rifles, stun and fragmentation grenades. Sarah nodded in agreement. Uniformed police would have been enough to usher people out, and why weren't there any firemen with them? Where were the paramedics? "Kaliba," Sarah muttered to Ellison. "It had to be. Keep moving." The officer pushed the man in front of them through the open entrance. Sarah made a mental check of where her gun was, back of my jeans, above the right pocket. If need be, she could draw down and drop the man in a heartbeat. Then they'd have to make a run for it and hope to escape. It wasn't the best plan she'd ever come up with, she had to admit. She'd thought up a number of different scenarios and escape plans for her meeting with Weaver, but what to do in case of a kamikaze drone attack on the building just hadn't been one of them. "What happened to her?" the officer asked. "She needs a doctor." Ellison hefted Cameron's body for emphasis. Her jacket was coated in blood, burns, and was torn from dozens of bullet holes. The armed man looked at Cameron's inert form for a moment, but Ellison stared him square in the eye. "She's an intern working on the floor that got hit. She needs an ambulance now." The armed man stepped aside and let Ellison through. Sarah kept her head down still and followed straight after him. She was shoved through the door roughly as the man tried to hurry more and more people out, more concerned with clearing the building than noticing her identity. Not that Sarah was complaining. "We'll take my car," Sarah replied. "It's across the street." She pointed to the Dodge Ram parked in a space across the road. She hadn't bothered to park it in Zyra Corp's lot because she'd wanted a quick out after she'd have blown the John Henry AI sky high. Now she was glad she had, because she looked to the side and saw more men dressed in SWAT gear at the exit of the underground parking lot. They quickly separated themselves from the mass of people milling around like sheep outside. "I think I'm the only one who actually read the fire safety leaflets," Ellison observed as he watched them all standing absently like cattle. A few had taken the opportunity to light up cigarettes. Some chatted whilst looking fearful. He saw Mr. Murch stood alone but didn't call out to him. They needed to get far away as quickly as possible. They crossed the road and made it to the ram without another word passing between them. Ellison placed Cameron's body in the back and then went to the front passenger side. Sarah sat down in the driver's seat and had the engine on before Ellison had even sat down. She put the car into drive and pulled out before he'd even closed the door properly or put his seatbelt on. She continued down the road, putting her foot down on the gas and quickly accelerating up to the speed limit, then stuck rigidly to it. She'd made it this far despite being a wanted fugitive now very much in the public eye. She didn't want to blow it being pulled over for speeding by a donut-dunking traffic cop. Sarah drove the next few blocks while Ellison sat quietly beside her. She took a left away from downtown LA, drove 2 more blocks down, and then turned right. She didn't know where she was going. She just wanted to get distance and a few angles between her and Zyra Corp while she figured out what to do. "Who are Kaliba, anyway?" Ellison asked, finally, breaking the silence. "Weaver never told you," Sarah asked. "Never mentioned Kaliba, no. We knew something was after John Henry. Something tried to hack into him. He called it his brother, an AI like him." "Another AI?" Sarah asked, forcing herself to slow down as they approached an intersection and the light turned red. She stopped the car and waited, lest she attract any police attention. "Where is it?" "We don't know. It took him down before he knew it, and he never found his brother again." "Don't call it that," Sarah snapped irritably. "They're not human. They don't have brothers." She looked at Ellison for a moment and remembered what John had told her, that the former agent had been teaching it things. "What the hell were you teaching that thing anyway?" "Morals," Ellison replied. "Ethics, the value of human life." "These things don't care about human life," Sarah shot back. The very idea of a machine caring about humans was ludicrous. All they did was kill. What did a machine care about human life? John Henry did, Ellison said calmly. The lights turned green and Sarah turned left and headed south, while Ellison continued. "It took him a while, but he got there. He was very fond of Savannah, even made me promise I'd get her back when you took her." Sarah found that a tough pill to swallow. She'd assumed up until now that this John Henry was Skynet, and Catherine Weaver was working alongside Kaliba. The fact she was a T-1000 had made it all the more likely. But she hadn't skewered John on sight like she'd have expected a machine out to kill him. She'd even proposed an alliance. Now Ellison said that something had tried to kill Weaver's AI, and that new computer could only be Skynet. She realized, painfully, that they should have gone to Weaver from the start as soon as Ellison had suggested it. They might have been able to avoid all this. "Look at that." Ellison pointed to a set of traffic lights to their left. The lights were off and cars had jammed up the intersection, creating a mass of angry drivers blaring away at their horns. Indeed, every intersection they passed was the same. The lights were off. They passed stores with no lighting inside, and when Ellison tested the radio, all he got was static on every station. "Blackout," Sarah nodded. It was curious, but she wasn't overly fussed by it. Blackouts could work in their favor. It meant security cameras should all be offline. "Must be that time machine. Something like that'd need a lot of power. I wouldn't be surprised if the whole city's blacked out." Sarah grunted in reply, not really interested. Something else had caught her attention. She looked in her rear-view mirror and saw a black sedan 3 cars behind them that she swore she'd seen a few miles ago. She turned the next left and carried on driving, giving out no sign that she was aware of it. She looked back in the mirror and saw the sedan still behind, having also turned left. Sarah turned 2 more lefts and circled the block, signaling with each turn and just driving normally. The sedan stayed with them, now 2 cars behind. "Look straight ahead," Sarah instructed Ellison. "Don't turn your head around, don't look back, we're being followed." "Black Buick, 2 cars back," Ellison said coolly without missing a beat. He saw the look of surprise on Sarah's face and gave a small smile. "I was FBI, remember? I do know a thing or two about surveillance." Sarah smiled back, relieved she wasn't partnered up with a complete amateur. "We gotta lose them," she said. "How'd they find us?" "I'm guessing the cops who weren't cops," Ellison said, remembering the armed man who let him and Sarah through with Cameron's body. They probably let us through and radioed us in for another team to follow while they clear the building and go in to take care of John Henry. That's how I'd do it, he thought. Sarah picked up speed slightly and carried on. They didn't know she was aware of them. If they knew then, they'd back off and have another team standing by to approach, or they'd do something drastic, maybe go from following to attacking. She didn't know if it was just the Buick or if there were other cars following further behind. She couldn't see any that she recognized, but that meant nothing. She saw a sign for the freeway on the next right, but continued on as if she were going to go past it, hugging the left side of their lane and drove on still. Sarah turned the wheel hard right at the very last second and swerved violently into the on-ramp leading to the freeway, earning several angry honks in reply as she cut off a car behind her. Ellison clutched tightly to the door handle and stared at Sarah in shock as the force of Sarah's turn pushed him into the car door. What the hell? The Buick swerved even more violently than Sarah had as its driver struggled to stay behind them, clipping the back of a van and barely managing to avoid a steel barrier separating the on-ramp from the main road. It's just the one car, Sarah told Ellison. If there'd been more than one, the sedan would have just carried on, and the driver radioed to other teams that he'd temporarily lost her. A backup car would have accelerated forward to get eyes on her. It came as a relief that it was only the one team. It was Kaliba's first mistake today, and she planned on taking advantage of it. Sarah put her foot down on the gas and pushed the Ram forward as fast as she could. The Ram was a heavy beast and not built for speed, however, and the Buick accelerated and easily kept up with them. She didn't need a lot of speed, though, just enough to make them think she was trying to outrun them. "Do you mind telling me what you're doing?" Ellison asked. As I said, "It's just the one car, so they have to keep up with us." Sarah gripped the wheel harder and put the gas to the floor, pushing past 75 and still accelerating. The car kept up and turned into the lane right of theirs, pushing forward. Sarah barely glanced at it but could see movement inside, probably a team inside readying weapons for a drive-by, she imagined. The car started to pull up alongside them. She quickly checked the rear-view mirror once more, saw nothing was immediately behind her, and slammed on the brakes as hard as she could. The Ram screeched in protest as its wheels stopped turning and grated against the tarmac, and the sedan shot forward before the driver could react. Sarah put her foot down again and built up speed. She'd timed it perfectly. She'd slowed down enough for the sedan to overshoot them, but still had enough speed to keep close behind. Sarah felt a little bit of pride in her abilities as they accelerated behind the sedan. She liked to think even Cameron wouldn't have been able to pull it off quite as well. Wishful thinking, she knew deep down, but she pushed that thought away and enjoyed the moment. 3 of them. Ellison pointed at the sedan as they sped up behind it. 2 were in the front and a third in the rear. A driver and 2 gunners, Sarah reckoned. At least one automatic and Uzi or some other kind of submachine gun, or at least that's what she'd use. Something small, light, and easy to move when inside a moving car. She was proven right when the man in the back leaned out of the open window, held out an MP5 and fired, hosing their car with automatic fire. The windscreen cracked and rounds slammed into the Ram's hood. Glass shattered as one of the lights was blown out, but neither Sarah nor Ellison were hit, and the engine seemed undamaged. They didn't lose speed or explode, and Sarah took that as a good omen so far. "Hold on," Sarah warned as she floored the gas. The sedan was to the right and just in front of a large semi-truck. She pulled out her pistol and handed it to Ellison. "Lean out and fire, just keep them distracted." To his credit, Ellison took the weapon without question, holding on to the seat for dear life to keep balanced and aimed as best as he could with one hand and on the move. He fired steady, aimed shots at the car and had no idea if he'd hit them or not. The gunner in the back took cover, and Sarah pulled in just behind and to the left. She viciously swerved right and struck the sedan's back wheel. The weight of the larger, heavier Ram easily nudged the back of the car out to the right and caused it to skid right into the semi behind it. Sarah drifted left and continued on, seeing the semi smash into it in her wing mirror. The car was thrown aside by the semi even as its driver screeched to a halt to avoid them, and the smaller vehicle flipped end over end. "Where did you learn that?" Ellison asked, his heart going ballistic inside his chest. "You don't want to know," she replied. Sarah didn't bother to look back at the sedan. It wasn't going to follow them anywhere now, and if any of the three inside survived, they'd be in no state to carry on working for Kaliba. She calmly slowed down and drove just like everyone else on the freeway. She wanted to get off the busy road and get lost once more. Ideally, she'd head into the desert and lay low for a while, but Kaliba was still out there, and hiding out in the wilderness wasn't going to stop Judgment Day. "We need to get off the freeway," she told Ellison. "And we're going to need to steal a new car." "No way," Ellison shook his head vehemently. "We're not stealing." They were on the same side now, but Ellison wasn't going to become a thief no matter what. He'd tried to be an honest man his whole life, to do good, and although he'd committed a few indiscretions as of late, lying to Weaver, asking John Henry to do the same, lying to the Bureau about Cromarty and George Laszlo, but he wasn't about to steal even if it was in aid of a greater good. Not unless there was absolutely no alternative, not to mention the fact a stolen car would just attract attention to them. "We find a used car dealership and we buy one there." "Fine." Sarah rolled her eyes and kept a lookout for the next exit. She'd play it Ellison's way and be honest for now. They'd find the crappiest, most ill-reputable-looking place they could find. Somewhere that would take cash in payment and not ask too many questions. Kaliba knew her face, and undoubtedly, they'd now know Ellison's. Now more than ever, they needed to stay off the radar. Derek stood over the blasted, smoking, and half-melted remains of the Terminator laid on its back on the ground. He gritted his teeth and shuddered at how close it had come to wiping them all out. The walls were covered in scorch marks and craters caused by plasma rounds and bullets fired from both sides. Dozens, hundreds of bullet holes marked the wall closest to the machine as a testament to the immense amount firepower it had taken to put it down. The bodies of the dead were lined up by one wall, their faces and chests covered up by their jackets to hide the horrific wounds sustained by the machine's plasma rifles. Nobody wanted to remember their friends like that. Evans and his constant haggling, wheeling and dealing. Baines and his homemade wood alcohol, sharing it out freely to boost morale. Thomas' endless list of sick, dirty, and downright tasteless jokes. That's how he wanted to remember them all, not by the charred holes that had been punched through their bodies, or their heads burnt into blackened gourds by superheated plasma rounds. He kicked out hard at what was left of the machine's head, spewing charred flesh and pieces of intricate circuitry onto the floor. "Fucking metal," he growled. Smoke and the stench of burnt metal and flesh invaded his mouth and nose and forced him into a violent coughing fit. He finally coughed out the last of the smoke from his lungs and spat onto the floor. The acrid taste was still in his mouth, and he knew it would be for some time. The whole place was filled with smoke. The plasma rifles kicked out a good amount of carbon dioxide when they were fired repeatedly, not a problem when firing them outside as they were most commonly used, but in close quarters inside a tunnel. And when it had taken so much firepower and so long to defeat the machine, it had built up to uncomfortable levels and would take a while to clear in the poorly ventilated underground chamber. Kyle appeared out of the haze of smoke, and Derek couldn't even begin to describe the overwhelming relief that washed over him. He hadn't seen his brother at all since the machine attacked. "Where the hell were you?" Derek asked. "I thought the metal got you." "No, but Connor did," Kyle replied sheepishly. "He jumped me when the tin can arrived, beat the crap out of me, and ran off." "I'm sorry, Derek, he's gone." "This was him," Derek said simply, it being so clear to him now. "He arrives, and not long after so does a machine." There was no doubt in Derek's mind whatsoever. "He's working for Skynet." "Forget him," Kyle said. "We've got bigger problems right now." "You don't know how right you are," Allison approached with Cassie in tow beside her. The German shepherd sat obediently beside the brunette and waited patiently with wide-open eyes. "That metal's really pissed on our French fries. We lost 9 men. Daniels and Jensen are wounded. And we're down to only 4 plasma rifles and half a dozen grenades for the launchers." They had plenty of assault rifles still, but they generally did fuck all to a machine. Jesus, Kyle whispered beside her. All these people were their friends, they'd lived together for years, fought together, ate and foraged together, and now most of them were dead. There'd been 25 of them only days ago. Daniels and his team had gone, 9 killed in the tunnel. Now there were down to 13. He fought tears welling up in the corners of his eyes and turned away from Derek. He didn't want his big brother to see him crying. Allison's face softened as she pulled him into a hug and let Kyle bury his face in her shoulder. She didn't say it, but she needed the support almost as much as he did. Kyle had always tended to wear his heart on his sleeve a lot more than the others. He was the most sensitive out of their group, a trait she didn't really share but she admired a lot, though she'd never tell him that, of course. "We'll be okay, and we'll get that bastard, don't worry." She said it as much to reassure herself as him, and realized she was shaking as they embraced. With sadness, anger, rage, she didn't know, all of the above, she decided. Her fists clenched behind Kyle's back and her expression hardened with resolve. If she saw that kid again, she'd make good on her threat and order Cassie to eat John alive. On that note, Derek interrupted. They broke the embrace and turned back to face Derek. "I want Connor found and brought back here. The bastard can answer for what he's done to us." Derek was dead set on it now. Connor had to die slowly. There'd be no nice little chat this time, no interview like before, no giving him the benefit of the doubt. "I want search parties to sweep the tunnels. He can't have gone far." Kyle and Allison both nodded in unison, and the former's face hardened. He wiped the forming tears out of his eyes and unslung his plasma rifle. It was as if a switch had been thrown. Gone were the tears and the sadness, and a burning desire to see John pay replaced it. Innocent little brother Kyle disappeared as Kyle turned away from Derek, and in his place came Kyle the soldier. "Wait," Allison said, causing the others to stare at her as if she'd suddenly turned green and grown horns. "We don't need to go on some wild goose chase." Allison led Cassie into the room they'd interrogated John in and pulled Cassie's face towards the chair they'd sat the gray bastard in. Cassie sniffed the seat of the chair for several seconds. "Cassie, search." The German shepherd gave out a deep, guttural bark and tore out of their base and into the main tunnel. Allison quickly grabbed her pack and ran out after her. Kyle followed suit a moment later, both of them intent on catching up to John before he got away. Derek turned to 2 other armed men in his group and nodded at them. "Briggs, Mason, gear up and get after them." This John character was proving to be a real pain in the ass. He wasn't going to underestimate him. The 2 men quickly strapped on vests and webbing with their packs, readied their rifles, and made their way out of the base. "And tell Allison I want him back alive," he shouted out after them. A bullet in the head was no good. Derek had questions that needed answering, and he wasn't going to ask nicely this time. Derek went over to a chest of drawers against the wall and pulled out a map of LA County from the top. He opened it out and flattened it on top of the chest, leaning over it. A circle over downtown indicated their current position, but it had been compromised. So too had the basement, half a mile away where they'd found John. Derek had to assume that nowhere nearby was safe. They needed to relocate as quickly as possible in case the machines followed up with another attack. They had to be gone before another patrol came by to investigate. Derek looked at several red dots he'd drawn on the map possible secondary outposts and took a few moments to calculate the distance. It was about a mile away, not a great distance, but in the vast network of tunnels it would be enough for the moment. It was one of their fallback positions they'd set up in case this kind of thing happened. "Mac," he called out for his second in command. The taller soldier marched up to Derek. Soot and dust covered his face, and he'd been cut in several places by scalding hot shrapnel from plasma blasts. But he showed no outward signs of pain and took it like a trooper. Derek nodded at him, glad one of his most capable guys had survived the fight. "Take a couple men and scout out the metro line around East LA. We need somewhere safe, warm, and away from other people." Mac knew the tunnels well, as they all did after years of living underground. He didn't need the map to find his way around. "Make sure it's secure, then report back. We can't stay here much longer." "Got it," Mac faded away and disappeared to assemble a team. Derek folded up the map and placed it into his pocket. "Everyone else, stand to," he shouted out. In an instant, the remaining 6 picked up their weapons and moved into firing positions behind barrels, alcoves, and anything thick and heavy. Even Daniels and Jensen tried to overcome their injuries as best they could and aimed their weapons on the single entrance. Derek moved to the doorway of another room, pulled a steel water drum in front and crouched behind it, his plasma rifle shouldered and ready to fire on anything that approached. He wished that Cassie hadn't been the only dog to survive the Terminator attack. They could have used one to detect a machine early if it approached. Within seconds, the rest of Derek's group were all spread out, behind cover, and ready to face any attackers. He didn't know how long they'd have to wait like this. Until Daniels reported, he'd secured a new place for them and they were ready to move out, but he had no idea how long that could be. He'd stand half of them down shortly and have them take shifts on guard duty. When the Trip 8 didn't report back, Skynet would send another one to investigate. Right now, they were at the point of maximum danger. They just had to hope that Mac and his team found somewhere for them before Skynet came calling again. John groaned out in pain as he came to and forced his eyelids to open. His head and neck were killing him, and it hurt just to tilt his head. As he started to wake up, he realized he was laying in a puddle of filthy water, and he was shivering with cold. He reached up and hugged his arms around himself, causing tremendous pain in his left shoulder, and realized he was naked. John grunted and fought through the pain and rolled over onto his front. He pushed himself up and, agonizingly slowly, got up to his feet. He wobbled slightly as he stood, then leaned against the side of the sewer tunnel for support and started to check himself out in the dim light that filtered faintly through the holes in the ceiling. John prodded his jaw, neck, collarbones, ribs, and moved downwards, checking for broken bones. All of his fingers and toes seemed fine, and he gingerly took a few steps forward. His left knee was stiff and swollen. He figured one of the tunnel rats had stamped on it while he was out. He was horribly sore between the legs, so he reached down towards his loins. An electric shock tore through his body as he cupped his testicles, and John almost dropped to his knees with pain. He looked down and saw they were swollen to almost twice their normal size, and his entire groin was purple with bruising. They'd given his balls a good kicking after he'd blacked out. "Assholes," John muttered. He ran his tongue along the inside of his mouth, and as far as he could tell, all his teeth were still present and in one piece. The worst damage seemed to be his balls, knee, shoulder, and bruising to his back. The area over his right kidney was extremely tender, and he just had to hope that they hadn't damaged it. There probably wasn't a single hospital left in the world now, and he dreaded to think what healthcare constituted nowadays. John stepped forwards. His right knee screamed out in pain as he put weight on his leg, but he grit his teeth and pushed through it. He was freezing and needed to move, to get some body heat going. He needed clothes too, but had no idea where to get them underground. He couldn't go back to Derek's camp and ask for some. They'd believe 100% now that he was working for Skynet, and they'd shoot him on sight. He was completely on his own now. He'd have to fend for himself. Step by step, John slowly walked down the tunnel, wincing at the pain in his knee every time he pushed off with his right foot. Naked, freezing, he made his way down the darkened sewer. Splashing through the long, still stream of ice-cold, stagnant water that ran down the tunnel and served to further drain body heat down through his partially submerged feet. John lengthened his stride and broke into an awkward run, wanting to put more distance between himself and the tunnel before whoever won the fight decided to come after him. He saw a side tunnel up ahead on the right and turned into it, desperate to get out of the main passageway. The warmth and stench hit him as quickly as the sight registered from his eyes to his brain. Dozens of bodies. Some sat up and stared vacantly. Some chatted quietly, but many simply lay down on the cold ground. The only signs of life were the gentle rise and fall of their chests and the steam that billowed out of their mouths with each breath. They reminded John of the gangs of vagrants he'd seen milling around LA at night with nowhere to go, nothing to do, no hope, and no escape. These people were much the same. John had no doubt that these were the tunnel rats that his Derek had described. John limped towards the tunnel rats and pushed his way into the group, barging past several filthy, stinking, and wretched bodies. A few stared at John in surprise at his nakedness, but most turned their heads away after a few seconds. The novelty had quickly worn off, and they went back to being cold and miserable. He realized he'd stand out like a sore thumb if Derek's men as much as glanced inside the passage and pushed his way through them, hoping to find somewhere to hide and stay out of sight. Someone shoved him away, and John fell into another person, who pushed him back in the opposite direction. "Sorry," he muttered pathetically and shuffled on. He kept his gaze down and didn't try to make eye contact with anyone. He was a freak to them, naked, clean, and it was obvious to anyone with eyes to see that he didn't belong. He didn't know what someone might do to him if he made the wrong move or said the wrong thing. He shuffled past, mumbling quiet apologies as he tried to make himself lost in the mass of hopeless, wretched souls. They were all much the same, filthy, wearing tattered clothes and for the most part thin as rakes. But it was the smell that hit John the worst. They reeked. The stench of unwashed bodies, body odor, sweat, shit, and piss was overpowering. It took a supreme act of will for John not to gag. Eventually, John rounded a corner, and the mass of people thinned out to just a few sat or laid out on the ground. He had no idea what the hell these people were doing. Did they just stay here all the time and wait to die? It looked like it. A few people stood around an old TV set lay on its back. The screen had been smashed out, and inside a fire crackled and spat out small sparks. None of them had seen him yet, and he decided it would be better to keep it that way. Any of these guys would give him away to Derek's men in a heartbeat if they waved so much as a scrap of food in front of their noses. He found a small alcove in one wall, almost completely submersed in darkness and littered with crates, boxes, old newspapers, and myriad random items strewn about. John sneaked into it quickly and huddled in among the huddled in his alcove and poked his head out curiously, watching the TV crowd. One man turned a couple of what looked like rats on a makeshift spit above the fire. The smell of roasting meat wafted throughout the tunnel, and John's stomach started to rumble. He couldn't help but think about food. The last thing he'd eaten had been a chicken burger and fries from some kind of KFC rip-off joint opposite the motel he and Cameron had been hiding out in 3 days or 18 years ago. 18 years without food. That's got to be a world record, John thought to himself. He toyed with the idea of trying to get some rat for himself, but he had no idea how things down here worked. John took another glance at the group around the TV and realized there were 3 men standing guard. One of them carried a long metal pipe over his shoulder, and John couldn't see any weapons on the rest, but assumed from the way they carried themselves that they were armed. They watched out for anyone who might decide to get it into their heads to try and take some food for themselves. Even here down at the bottom of the food chain, there seemed to be a caste system among the tunnel rats. 2 more men entered the smaller section with a pair of skinny, filthy girls dressed in rags. To John, they looked maybe 14 at most. John recognized Kyle's jacket on one of the men and the long, filthy gray beard. It was the same bastard who'd beaten the crap out of him and left him naked. John was sorely tempted to return the favor, but one look at the small encampment told him this guy seemed to be either in charge or in a position of some sort of power among this group. The guy would probably recognize him instantly and decide to finish him off. The man pulled one of the girls towards him and stared at her like a cat eyeing up a tasty mouse. John couldn't see his face, but he reckoned the guy was grinning. The man ran his hand through her filthy, matted black hair and then cupped her face. He pulled up her top to reveal her breasts and made a sound of approval. John saw his head nodding, and he took a skewer with 2 rats on it, pulled one off and handed it to the girl. She pulled it up to her mouth and rapidly devoured it, ripping and gnawing desperately at the tiny morsels of meat on the rodent, scouring it for every last shred. The bearded man ate his too, taking more time than the girl. When he was finished, he took her by the hand and led her away from the main group towards an even more secluded section. John realized what was going on. The girls were being whored out. Food for sex. It made him sick to his stomach. They were kids, barely even high school age. The man led the girl through the passageway. Their route took them close to John, and he flattened himself against the wall, curled up into a ball, and stayed as still as he could, hoping they wouldn't see him in the shadows. The tunnel rat and the girl passed by the alcove and didn't see John hidden in the shadows, but John saw their faces very well, and he could make out faint bruising around one eye, though her face was so caked in grime it was hard to make anything out through it. What John found even worse was the expression on her face. She wasn't nervous or afraid. She seemed strangely nonchalant about it, as if she'd done it so many times that it was all in a day's work for her. It made John ill. They passed by and John waited in place, sitting silently in the alcove, hidden by the pile of rubbish and the darkness. He felt around for anything useful and found very little, mostly boxes, crates, empty cans, bottles, and spent food wrappers. He found nothing useful, and when he stopped shuffling around the items around him, he saw his hands were caked in dirt and grime. John smeared some of the grime and dust onto his face and body, making himself as dirty and filthy as he could so he could try and pass as one of the tunnel rats, though without clothes it would be hard. He covered himself in slimy, damp brick dust and some kind of black substance that smelt foul. He didn't have a mirror, but he reckoned he'd messed himself up enough to pass for a tunnel rat at a glance, albeit a naked one. He was still freezing cold and needed to find some clothes, not just to blend in, but to keep from freezing to death. Within a few minutes, John heard loud groaning and panting coming from down the tunnel his right, accompanied by the faint slap of flesh on flesh. The bearded guy was taking his payment for the rat, John figured. He couldn't hear any sounds from the girl. He remained sat where he was and shivered, and listened out to the sounds of sex coming from around the corner. He wasn't a voyeur and wasn't particularly interested in what they were getting up to, but he wanted to listen out so he'd know when they were finished. It didn't take long. John didn't have a watch and doubted there were many if any watches or clocks still working in the world, but he guessed it was maybe 10 minutes before the grunting stopped. Not long after the girl walked quickly back past John's alcove. Her hair stuck out more than it had before, and her clothes were disheveled. John waited until she'd gone and then snuck out of his alcove and into the tunnel. He quickly and quietly moved towards where the girl had come from and kept close to the walls, trying to stay in the shadows as much as he could. He saw the man sat on the ground in a small room, redressing himself slowly. As the man started to pull his trousers back up, John shot forward as fast as he could and plowed into him, knocking him over onto the ground. He drew back his fist and smashed the man in the face as hard as he could, so hard it stung his wrist from the impact. He felt the man's nose crack under his knuckles, and his head smashed onto the hard ground and bounced back up like a ball. The man launched his booted foot into John's stomach and forced the air from his lungs. John wheezed out and struggled to breathe, staggering back a couple of steps. "What the fuck?" The man spat and glared at him. John stopped struggling for breath and dived forward again, pushing himself to take the initiative. If he didn't, he was dead. He knocked the man down and saw a flash of shining metal as he drew out a knife. John grabbed the man's arm and forced all his weight down on it, trying to pin the limb down and keep the blade away from him. His chest burnt and his lungs felt like they swelling and about to explode. John's head spun in dizziness, but he fought through it, ignoring the pain. John turned the blade down towards the man's chest and forced it downwards, slowly overpowering his opponent. John hadn't starved or lived on scraps and dead rats for years. He'd generally been active and he knew how to fight. He found himself quickly gaining the upper hand on the tunnel rat. He forced his weight down on his arm and swept his foot out against his opponent's legs, knocking them out from under him. The man fell forward onto John and knocked him onto his back, landing on John's chest with a cry of pain. John clamped down on the tunnel rat's mouth with his free hand to muffle his cries and pushed the man off of him, rolling the tramp onto his back. John quickly realized what had caused the man to cry out in pain. When he'd fallen on the top of the knife, which was now sunk to the hilt in his stomach. Blood poured from the wound and stained his sweater dark crimson. The tunnel rat's eyes were wide open with fear and pain, and he shook violently as he bled out onto the floor. John yanked the knife out and kept his hand over the man's mouth in case he screamed out anymore. Eventually, the shaking and flapping slowed and faded into trembling, and then that stopped. John stood up and avoided looking at the wide-open, vacant eyes. Guilt instantly welled up inside him. He'd killed someone once again, and this time it wasn't defending himself and his mom. He'd actively gone after the guy, chosen to pick a fight, and killed him. "I'm sorry," John muttered as he turned the guy over onto his front and pulled the sweater off, yanking the sleeves off his arms and pulling them free. He quickly stripped the tunnel rat of everything except his boxer shorts and got dressed. He pulled on the filthy, stinking trousers, blood-stained shirt and sweater, and picked Kyle's coat off the floor by the wall and pulled it over himself. He wiped off the knife and stuck it into the coat pocket, then checked it for anything useful. There was nothing on the body apart from the clothes and the knife. John peeked out of the chamber to make sure nobody had heard the fight. People milled around the fire and ate more cooked rats. Nobody approached, and nobody showed any sign of having noticed the brawl or coming to investigate. Either they didn't hear it, or they just didn't care. From what he'd seen so far, either case was just as likely. He walked back through the tunnel and went back the way he'd come, moving through the crowding groups of tunnel rats in the larger side chamber. Now he was clothed and looking filthy. Nobody paid him any mind. His coat concealed his frame, and he looked just the same as the rest of them. John pushed through the groups and reached the main tunnel. He peeked either side and couldn't see or hear anything. No sign of Derek's men or any machines. He left the tunnel rats behind and marched quickly through the main tunnel. He couldn't stay in the tunnels anymore. There was too much of a risk that Derek's men would find him. And he had no idea where Cameron was, but he doubted she and John Henry would be underground. John Henry had gone to the future for a reason, and whatever it was, they wouldn't achieve it in a sewer. John kept going through the dark tunnel. The cold, stagnant water not so uncomfortable now. He had some boots on his feet. Eventually, he found a ladder leading up to a closed manhole cover. John climbed up to the ceiling, wrapped one arm around the top rung, and pushed up against the cover with his free hand. It was heavy and stuck in place by years of neglect, but with a lot of heaving and grunting, John managed to push it up, then slid it aside enough for him to pull himself up through. John emerged into a dark, devastated landscape and was immediately assaulted by freezing air and violent howling winds that bit into his face. He shielded himself from the gusts and then looked at the scene before him. Destruction surrounded him as far as the eye could see. The skyline of LA had been obliterated, and only the broken skeletons of structures remained. An aircraft flew over the bent and crooked remains of a skyscraper in the distance and shined a searchlight down on the ground as it hovered. Another similar aircraft, a sleek, wingless drone with cylindrical engines on the sides of the fuselage and downwards pointing tailplanes, flew low and fast over a building John recognized as once being City Hall, and fired bluish-white bolts of plasma fire at something he couldn't see. Whoever was down on the ground fired back with conventional assault rifles. He spotted muzzle flashes and heard their cracking reports a split second later. Tracer flew up into the air and missed the machine. The HK fired again, and the second machine broke from its hover and joined in the fray. The rifle fire stopped. Either the men retreated or the HK got them. The aircraft pulled up higher into the air and moved on. John had heard people describe the future, the destruction and the machines, people starving and hiding, and he'd tried to imagine it, but the reality was just another world. The utter devastation, desolation. How the hell did he manage to turn all this around? He couldn't believe that in some other future he'd managed to pull mankind out of the ashes and rise up to beat Skynet. This was a broken, dead world. Only one word came to mind. One word could possibly describe this future he'd emerged into: hopeless. Completely, utterly hopeless.